My name is Victoria Pasquantonio, and I run PBS News Hour Classroom, News Hour's current events website for middle and high school students and teachers. Today, I'm speaking with David Sirota, journalist and founder of The Lever, an investigative, nonpartisan news organization dedicated to holding the powerful to account. He also received an Oscar nomination for co-writing the film Don't Look Up, which I really would love to interview you about, but maybe another time. David spent several years with his team creating the podcast Master Plan, investigating how America got to be where it is now, where the majority of people don't vote and where distrust of America's political institutions, powerful corporations, and the news media is at an all-time high. So we're not just talking corruption either, but legal corruption seems to be running rampant, which is also a major focus of the podcast. So, David, on that positive note, it's great to have you with us today. And I'm just thinking, like right off the bat, looking to what you remember learning about civics and government in school, and well, maybe your own son who's taking civics. Do you have anything to say right off the bat that this podcast master plan could be helpful for teachers and students?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that in America, when we learn American history, when we learn civics, especially in American history, you hear about corruption every now and again. Back in the era of Tammany Hall, at the beginning of the 20th century, that was supposedly our corruption moment. But I would also say that while those were scandals that are written about in our history books, that the way money determines political outcomes is as intense or even more intense today than it even was back then. I think in our civics classes, we're taught that in a democracy, uh, one person has one vote, and that the system is based on that one person, one vote system electing our representatives who answer to us, the voters. But what I think our series shows is that we don't we technically have a one person, one vote system, but the way the votes are essentially bought is something that is not taught in our civics books a lot. And by that, I mean, yes, every single person in the country has only one vote themselves. But if you have a lot of money, you have a much more powerful way to communicate with a lot of voters. And if you don't have a lot of money, it's much harder to communicate with enough voters to win office. So what that ultimately means is that for the most part, the people with the most money end up winning office. The people who can either spend their own money, they're wealthy personally, or they are able to attract money from other people with lots of money. Those are the people who tend to win office. And so a politics that's dominated so much by money, where who has the money determines the political outcome, in practice, it can seem like a democracy because everyone goes and votes, or at least everyone has the right to vote, but not everybody has the right and or ability to communicate with voters in an election. And so that rigs the democratic process. It makes the country and the society less democratic. It makes the elected representatives answer less to the voters and more to the people giving them money.
Yeah, this is so different than how a lot of kids learn about how American government works. And so, however, I think many of them are interested in more the reality of the situation. I have to give kids a lot of credit. So often educators teach history chronologically or thematically, and you do both of these in master plan. Corruption or how many money got into politics is a huge theme of the podcast. So just to back up, what do you mean by corruption? And maybe focusing on the idea of legal versus illegal corruption. In other words, like, is it only when politicians personally benefit, like Bob Menendez with his gold bars, or is it more when politicians get campaign contributions and do favors with those contributions?
I would define corruption as the things that short circuit the way a democracy is supposed to work. A non-corrupt system is one in which a candidate goes out, campaigns for office on a level playing field, can meet as many voters and can communicate with as many voters as possible, and wins on the basis of their ideas, and then represents those voters in office. Money is a corrupting force because, as I just mentioned, money allows certain candidates to communicate a lot more with voters and make sure that other candidates who don't have money can't really communicate with voters. And so money corrupts and short circuits the process. So I think, yes, corruption can be self-enriching for a politician. They pass a policy that enriches, let's say, their business or their family. That's corrupt. That's one form of corruption. Another form of corruption is a politician gets lots of campaign money from a particular industry and then goes and passes a policy that benefits that industry and harms that politician's voters. And it benefits that industry that is then giving them campaign contributions. The campaign contributions, in a sense, are an investment by the industry in getting a return on the investment. And when that happens, that's a short circuiting and a corruption of the democratic process. It's not supposed to be that way. That's not how a democratic government is supposed to work. Because in effect, the politician is operating on behalf of private interests, not the public interest.
Okay, thank you. Do you, well, on this note of corruption, you start out with Watergate and FECA, the Federal Election Campaign Act, which was supposed to fix how campaigns are financed. So just to go again, that little more basic, what is campaign finance reform? And I guess why is it such a key focus in your podcast?
So campaign finance laws after Watergate. Well, Watergate was a big scandal with the president of the United States and the White House. A lot of things happened in Watergate, but the shorthand version is there was a lot of money that came into President Richard Nixon's campaign. A lot of it illegal, a lot of it not disclosed, so secret. A lot of it from major corporations that had things that they wanted from the White House, policies that they wanted from the White House. And some of that money was used by Nixon's cronies to do all sorts of illegal things to the opposition party at the time, the Democrats. They did a break-in that was illegal. All of this came out. And so what happened after Watergate was Congress, in response, passed a number of new laws that said, that put in place limits on how much money any individual donor could give to any politician, and put in place laws that were supposed to require the disclosure of those donations. So the public has a sense of who is giving money to my congressperson or my senator or my president. So that's the basics of campaign finance laws, that you can't you're not supposed to be able to just give as much money as you want to any politician you want, because the idea is that corrupts the democratic process. And if you give money to a politician, you have to disclose who you are so the public understands who's funding their representatives. And at the time, after Watergate, they tried to put in place spending limits so that the candidates themselves couldn't spend unlimited amounts of money to drown out their opponent. Those are the basics of campaign finance laws, which were passed after Watergate, and there was talk, which I think would have been a good idea, of creating a public financed system of elections, where instead of having to raise money from individual private donors who want things from the politician, that a politician could run for office, and if they got enough signatures or enough very small donations, they could have access to funding from the government to run their campaign. The idea being that that kind of funding does not come with the expectation of favors. It does not come with the demand for the politician to pass policies that help an industry or a billionaire. Public financing of elections did not happen. It was blocked. And subsequently, after Watergate, there was a push, and this is what our podcast is about, to weaken those campaign finance laws to ultimately give us a campaign finance system that we basically have today, which is a campaign finance system that allows for large amounts, essentially unlimited amounts of secret money to flood into elections to try to tilt the outcome of elections in ways that the public can't even tell who is spending the money.
Okay, so following up on what happened to FICA and the efforts for campaign finance reform that you were just talking about, there are two cases, Supreme Court cases that you really hone in on. I think a lot of maybe say 11th or 12th grade teachers will teach Buckley versus Vallejo. That was in 1976, followed a couple years later by First National Bank of Boston versus Velati. Maybe seventh grade or eighth grade civics teachers should be teaching these two Supreme Court cases. I'm not sure if there are as much, but I'm wondering how important is it to teach these two cases?
I think it's very important. Buckley v. Vallejo, the first one, the court was essentially asked to rule on the constitutionality of the Federal Election Campaign Act after Watergate. And one side said money that goes into politics is a corrupting force, and therefore the government has a right to regulate how much money can flow to politicians, can flow into elections. The other side said, no, 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 no. Money is the equivalent of speech. Money is constitutionally protected speech. And they argued that anybody has a First Amendment constitutional right to spend as much money as they want to try to tilt the outcome of an election. And the Supreme Court in that Buckley v. Vallejo case essentially ruled with that argument, saying that money is not corruption, money is constitutionally protected speech. What came soon after that was the Bellotti decision, which said money from corporations, not just individual people, that corporations have the same First Amendment rights to spend as much money as they want in elections as do individual people. So essentially, corporations are now under the law people. And this was a groundbreaking, in my view, a very bad, destructive ruling that gave corporations and all of their money the ability to really spend lots and lots of money to tilt elections towards the politicians that would give those corporations the policies that they want, oftentimes policies that hurt the voters.
So the teachers really like primary sources. So even checking out those two, the documents from those two court cases, I think would be really helpful for teachers, and I think students would find interesting. But perhaps the Lewis Powell memo would also be a good one for students to comb over. It's a major focus also of your podcast. And I'll start out real basic, but what do you mean by a memo in this context? And how core was the Powell memo to the idea that corporations were going to have so much say in how America is governed?
So in 1971, Lewis Powell was the head of the American Bar Association and was a tobacco industry lawyer. So he was a very well-respected, very prominent, very powerful lawyer. And the early 1970s was a time when the government was quite responsive to what the public was demanding. It was quite democratic, not Democratic Party, but small d Democratic. It was the era that saw the passage of Medicare, Medicaid, the creation of the EPA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. The government had declared a war on poverty. And the business elite of the country, the oligarchs of the time, felt under attack. They didn't like that the government was encroaching on their ability to do whatever they want to make as much money as they wanted. And so Lewis Powell wrote a memo, which was really just an essay, a blueprint for what to do about this. He was upset about how responsive the government was becoming to what people wanted. And so he wrote this memo, which said that essentially business is under attack in America, and that corporations and people with lots of money, oligarchs, should use the disproportionate amount of money that they have in society to try to take back power in the government. Essentially, he understood that a handful of billionaires and big corporations may not have lots of votes at their disposal, but they have lots of money. So he counseled that they should use their resources to try to exert more control over the government and make it do what business wanted, not necessarily what the average voter wanted. And so he counseled a lot of different things, including a focus on taking over the judiciary, installing judges who would support big business, would issue rulings for big business. One of the Bellotti ruling that we just talked about, saying that corporations are essentially people who have the right to spend in an unlimited way on elections, that was written by Lewis Powell, because soon after Lewis Powell wrote his Powell memo, Lewis Powell was appointed to the Supreme Court, where he could start implementing the things that he recommended in the Powell memo.
And I think students and teachers will really love delving into this and find it fascinating. I think it's two full episodes, basically.
Yes.
So, do you have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so great. Just going back to, well, the Gilded Age is such a huge part of students' learning. And you talked about this a little at the start with Tammany Hall, but talking about the Gilded Age, contrasting money and politics today with the Gilded Age, is it much better or worse or about the same? I know you're sort of saying that it's kind of worse, but I'm wondering if you could talk more about why that is the case.
I'm not sure it was better or worse, but what I can say is this. Much more at the turn of the century, in 1900, at the early 20th century, much more was out in the open in a way that was sort of more brazen. We're talking about literally cash in envelopes, bags of cash being handed out to politicians. There were fewer laws on the books at all about corruption back then. So it was kind of the Wild West back then. But I think what we've done, what our country has done since then, is essentially made laws that make this legal. So, in other words, whereas beforehand there weren't many laws, and there certainly weren't a lot of laws being enforced about whether you could pay a politician for that politician to pass policies for you. What we live in now is we have laws that essentially make a lot of this legal, officially legal. You are officially allowed to put in as much money as you want into a super PAC in an anonymous way and have it spend money on elections. That's not in a legal gray area. That is now legal. So we have, in a sense, legalized forms of bribery that were happening back in the Gilded Age. Whereas before in the Gilded Age, it was operating in kind of a legal vacuum, or the laws weren't being enforced. We have subsequently legalized a lot of the bad things that were happening in the Gilded Age, legalized them, and I should add, normalized them. by legalizing the fact that you can give your congressperson, you can bundle money, you can get a bunch of your friends to give $5,000 contributions in a huge way, a bunch of $5,000 contributions to your congressperson, so that it adds up to a lot of money, and you're making demands up for your congressperson to give you a special policy. The fact that we've made that legal normalizes it. What it says is, this isn't bad, this isn't illegal, this isn't wrong. This is now what politics is. And I would argue that that is what politics has become, but that's not democracy.
Okay, I actually did want to talk to you about that normalization. I've heard you talk about that a couple other times. And that is something that, as a former teacher for many years and doing the work I do now, but also I know teachers care so much about having their kids grow up thinking that they can run for Congress, that they
Right.
could even be president. And the idea is, they know about the corruption, but there is that fear that that's going to become normal for these younger generations, even more than maybe it was for you and me. And I'm just wondering, what can students do if they're concerned about all of this?
I think it's a great question. I mean, look, certainly, if you're going to run for office, it is a process of having to raise large amounts of money. I think that has been normalized. That right now, the only way to run for a major office is to go to a lot of very rich people or a lot of corporations and ask them to contribute to your campaign. And when you ask them to do that, a lot of them are going to say, well, what are you going to give me in return? And I think that's a sad reality of our system. I will say this: I think the more local that you go, the smaller an office you run for, in some cases, the less determinative money may be, because you can actually meet all of the voters. So it's not to say that every single level of government is corrupted. It's only to say that certainly as you go higher on the governmental ladder, money plays a bigger and bigger role because there's more money at stake, right? I mean, like a federal contract for a corporation can be worth billions of dollars. And so that company might say, we're going to invest a couple $1 million in campaign contributions to get a multi-billion-dollar federal contract. Um, that may that's less the case if you're running for city council or for local town council. So I would say get involved. If you're going to get involved and you want to look at running for office, get involved. Start out at as local a level as possible. I would also say this: if you're looking for things to pressure your congressperson on or talk to them about, I always go back to public financing of elections. That there should be a way for people to run for office in this country, any office, where they don't have to beg corporations and billionaires for money in order to finance the campaigns that they need to run in order to win. There should be another source of funding that doesn't come with the expectations of government favors, that doesn't come with strings attached. To me, that is a central way to fix part of this problem.
I know there's more episodes of the podcast coming out, so maybe this is in there somewhere, but I'll ask it anyways. Have you studied other countries' solutions, and have you found anything there that you think could be implemented here in America? And I guess public financing is one of those things,
Yeah,
right?
I mean that's the big one. Public financing of elections is a big one. Um, some other countries have stronger campaign contribution limits, limits on outside spending and the like. How much you can spend in a super PAC. There are all sorts of ways to limit the amount of money in our politics. I frankly don't think that that we have a problem of a lack of solutions. I think we have a lack of political will. What I worry about is that because this is the way politics now is, we as a society, think there's nothing to be done about it. It's an inevitability. It's a force of nature. But that's actually not true. Uh, we are, the United States stands out as an industrialized society for having a privately financed political system with so much money flooding in. That is anomalous in the world. It's not to say money doesn't play any role in other countries' politics. It's only to say that it plays an outsized role in our politics compared to other similarly positioned democracies across the world.
Do you have anything else you want to add? I really have appreciated your time today.
Uh, no, I don't think there's anything I want to add other than that, just to reiterate that point that, look, um, corruption can feel like a hopeless thing, can be an incurable problem. It's not incurable. And I would also say it can feel like an abstract problem. Oh, money and politics, that's sort of a separate issue from everything else. And how does it really affect me in our in our daily lives? But it's the other way around. If I don't care what issue you are focused on in our society, whether it's the cost of healthcare, whether it's foreign wars, whether it's low wages, whether it's basically anything else in our society. If you don't like the policies that on any of those issues, you can usually follow the money and trace the policies back to which politicians are being paid or bankrolled by the industries that benefit from that policy. Wars are big business to defense contractors that spend a lot of money on campaign contributions to politicians. Um, the healthcare system and how healthcare bills are so high, and we're the only industrialized country in the world to not have government guaranteed healthcare. You can trace that back to health insurance companies giving lots of money to candidates running for office, and then the candidates getting into office and not creating a government sponsored healthcare system, because not having a government sponsored healthcare system allows those health insurance donors to make lots and lots of money. You can look at the climate crisis. Why aren't there better climate policies coming from our government? Well, the oil industry gives a lot of money to politicians. And in return, the politicians essentially block climate legislation that would reduce the consumption and burning of fossil fuels. So my point is that this is not a side issue. Corruption is connected to every single issue that anyone watching this video cares about. It is the issue behind all of the issues.
So I guess just to follow up on that, if we don't find some way to reform the Supreme Court, and again, going back to that Lewis Powell memo, is any of this possible? That seems to be a huge, huge part of the problem.
Yeah, look, I think reforming the Supreme Court, expanding the court, changing who's on the court, creating term limits for the court, I think is very important, because the court has passed all of these precedents that make it harder for there to be a civilized campaign finance system, equating money with constitutionally protected speech, et cetera, et cetera. But I also think, again, the Citizens United decision, which comes in a later episode of Master Plan, which built on that Bellotti decision. Even the Citizens United decision included things that we can still do that we don't do. The Citizens United decision said we can at least have laws in this country that require the disclosure of all campaign spending in the country. We don't have that right now. We're in the middle of an election right now. There's tens of millions of dollars being spent to try to tilt the election by people who don't even have to disclose who they are when they're spending that money. We can pass laws right now, even under the Citizens United doctrine, that would mandate the disclosure of those expenditures. And again, to go back to public financing, nothing in the Citizens United decision, as bad as that decision was, says you cannot have publicly financed elections. So even within the bad Supreme Court rulings, there are things we could still do right now, and that aren't being done but could be done.
To be honest, I didn't realize that. And I think that maybe a lot of folks don't. They just sort of see Citizens United as the end. So I'm really glad that you just said that. So thank you so much for your time, David. You can check out Master Plan online at the Lever News at levernews.com. Apple, Spotify, and more. This is Victoria Pasquantonio for PBS NewsHour Classroom, speaking with David Sirota, founder of The Lever and creator and narrator of the podcast Master Plan.